Welcome, everybody. My name's Andrew David Courtney. Welcome to the ADC podcast, where today I'm going to be sharing with you, I'm going to be sharing the stage with Daniel Dash from NB Lawyers to talk about risk mitigation practices for the business owners looking to build their wealth through their business as well. So welcome, Daniel Dash. How you doing?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Andrew. How are you?
Yes, very well. Thanks. Thanks for coming along and um, uh, sharing some of your knowledge today. Looking forward to sort of picking your brain on a few of these topics that we went over a few minutes ago.
Excellent.
So, quick question, mate. Do you mind just sharing a little bit of an origin story about yourself, and then expand upon NB where you're currently working?
Sure. So I'm a lawyer. I'm a commercial lawyer, and I've been a commercial lawyer now for close to 12 years. Look, how I always wanted to be a lawyer. Maybe not. I actually began as a keen undergraduate science student, and what appealed to me most, though, I think, was the logic and reason that gets applied in scientific inquiry. And I found there to be a lot of overlap with what we do in law, and that's why I ended up here.
There you go. All right, and a little bit about NB,
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear that, Andrew.
and a little bit about NB Lawyers.
So yeah, MB Lawyers. So MB Lawyers has four divisions to the business. We have migration law, property law, employment law, and commercial law. Really, what we aim to do is to assist business owners with any legal requirements that come up in the day-to-day operation of their businesses. We try to cater towards directors and shareholders, working out the best business structures and arrangements.
Yeah, great. Yeah, because I'd imagine that because as a business owner myself, as the business grows, there's a whole bunch of options coming at you as well, right? And you just need to work out, well, what's the best way to move the business forward so that you can keep the stakeholders you've got and potentially talk about equity, that kind of thing. So those are the kinds of matters that you deal with day to day, is it?
Exactly, that's right. And we try to be like a one-stop shop for business owners and directors in particular to meet all like any issues that might come up in the course of business.
Yeah, yeah, cool. And because now, selfishly for me, we are growing, right? So I wouldn't mind asking you, asking you about like employment contracts, for example, right? So I'm assuming the right sequence of events for a business owner to bring someone on is you need to write up a position description, and then you build out a employment contract off the back of that, and then you go ahead and make the offer. Is that the typical strategy?
Yeah, look, it is. I think one of the biggest issues we actually see is that employment contracts. Well, there's two big issues. The first one is employment contracts don't have position descriptions very well devised from the outset. So what you end up with is an employment contract which doesn't have any kind of duties description, and that can make it very difficult when it comes to holding the employee accountable for their work. And also, if you're trying to establish things like it's a slightly different topic, but whether or not a redundancy is necessary or not, knowing what the actual position description is can be very helpful for that. Another big issue we see is, frankly, just employers not using employment contracts that have been custom designed. They use a template or an example they found somebody else was using, a friend of theirs was using, and it's just not fit for purpose at all. It might include terms that apply to a particular industry that doesn't relate to their own. It might have obligations in there which are more onerous on the employer than would be the case of general law.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you. So, question about employers and trying to get rid of employees. So if you've got an employee, let's say a short-term employee versus a long-term employee, you don't have any contracts. You're trying to get rid of both of them. What are the risks as an employer that you have to consider if you're trying to move them on out of the business?
Okay. Well, look, it does depend on whether or not they are a long-term employee or a short-term employee. It also depends on the size of your business. So if you're a small business, if you terminate the employee within the first 12 months of employment, they're not protected from unfair dismissal laws, right? So what that means is that there's no real requirement to show that the termination is justified. There are, of course, other protections under employment law in any case which you need to assess. But one of the biggest problems we do see, especially for longer term employees, is that you don't have a clear KPI or duties description where you are evaluating the employee's performance against those criteria, and you're creating a justified reason for the termination. So look, having that PD in place really helps. It also helps in other ways. So, for example, assessing whether or not a modern award applies to the employee. You won't know that unless you actually have a set criteria, a set position description for them, which you can compare against the relevant modern awards and verify whether or not there might be other obligations that you owe to the worker.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you. Cool. My next question for you is obviously, as a business owner, we're looking to grow something. When you start a business, you're typically trying to grow something as much as possible. You've got these kind of wide-eyed, bushy-tailed kind of characters out there trying to build their businesses up, and obviously you've got plans to build something significant, essentially, right? And part and
Yes.
parcel of that is commercial leases, right? So the question that comes to my mind is what are the pitfalls that a lot of these business owners who are hoping to get that nice fit out or whatever it may be, what are the pitfalls that they may not see if they're trying to do it all by themselves?
Yeah, certainly. So we'd always recommend that you do get legal advice before entering into a lease in any case, right? But it depends on the nature of the business as well, and whether or not the lease you're entering into is what we call a retail shop lease or some other form of commercial lease. So the difference there is that a retail shop lease is a lease within a retail shop premises. To give you an example, which is very obvious, a lease within a large shopping centre would typically be a retail shop lease. And in that case, there's actually an obligation at law that you should get legal advice, and a lawyer will provide a legal advice certificate. So I'd say that to begin with, but I'd recommend in any case that you get legal advice. Now, in terms of the things to look out for when you are evaluating a commercial lease, some things will be obvious. Like you'll know the rent. The rent will be pretty obvious on the face of the lease, I would normally think. But you need to look at things like rent increases. So if you've got a long-term lease, let's say it's potentially a 10-year lease or a 7 or 8 year lease, rent increases will be built into the rent structure every year, and it's not uncommon to see rent increases of 4% every single year. And over the course of 10 years, that does add up quite a lot, as you can imagine. And it can get to the point where by the end of the lease, you're paying well above market rates in some cases. Likewise, it might affect the profitability of your business. So that's a big one we see. And another one along the same line in terms of financials is outgoings. You need to make sure or verify whether or not the lease includes the outgoings for the premises or does not. So whether or not it's what we call a gross lease, including the outgoings or not. And if it does include the outgoings, you need to look at the terms of the lease very carefully to verify what that actually means. So in other words, what can the landlord charge to your account in addition to the rent? Okay. And we see all sorts of things. It could be anything. It could be service charges. It could be land tax. It could be security costs. All sorts of things can count as outgoings. And from a financial perspective, we really recommend you look at your rent increases and look at your outgoings.
Yes, yes, I'm with you. Because worst case scenario, I mean, like a lot of businesses fail, right? So in the end, like what happens if they signed up for a 5 year lease and the business had to kind of fold in 3 years in with 2 years left? Is the director typically on the hook for that?
Yeah.
That's another thing to consider.
And so that comes under the category of what we call securities or security obligations under a lease. There's multiple ways you can provide security for a lease, and one of the most common ones and prevalent ones is that the directors of the business, or a related party sometimes will provide a guarantee, and that party is then personally on the hook for all rent and outgoings or any other obligations under the lease. Potentially for the remaining term of the lease. So if the lease is terminated early, let's say you have a 10-year lease and it gets terminated at the end of year 6, if it's terminated because you're in default, so you're not paying your rent or something, the landlord can go after you for the rent for the remaining term, which is obviously potentially catastrophic in some cases. It could be sufficient to send somebody insolvent. That said, there is an obligation that the landlord mitigate their loss. So what that means is they've got to advertise the premises for rent and try and find a new tenant. But nevertheless, it's no small undertaking to provide a guarantee. And we typically recommend to our clients that they consider like negotiating away from the guarantee and doing whatever they can not to provide a guarantee. And there is alternatives. So what you can do is you can also provide a larger security deposit or bank guarantee under the lease. So if the landlord comes to you and says, well, we want a bank guarantee equivalent to 3 months rent and outgoings plus a personal guarantee. Well, are you in a position maybe to offer a larger bank guarantee, but maybe waive the director's guarantee?
Yes, yes, I'm with you. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So definitely, yeah, you definitely need to see someone before signing any of these things, because you might put yourself in a bit of strife in a few
Yeah.
years' time if you're not planning well. Now, in terms of business planning, then like there's obviously there's the shares for companies out there who are growing, and what do you say about shareholder agreements, and how would you typically structure it up? And what's the best way to do it from the front end, like
Okay.
upon establishment?
Yeah, so this really comes down to I suppose, an issue of business structures and how you've agreed to set up your business from the outset. Um, Now, there's multiple ways you can run a business. You could run a business as a sole trader. You could run a business through a company, through a trust, or in partnership with another entity of some kind. I mean, the most prevalent ones we see in small business, though, by far are either a sole trader operating or a private company operating. Occasionally, you'll see a discretionary trust operating a business as well. Um, Maybe from a legal point of view, the most significant thing to consider is what type of liabilities the business might attract and whether or not you want to try and insulate your personal assets and personal wealth from the debts and obligations of the business. And one of the simplest ways to do that is, rather than using a sole trader structure where you're personally operating the business, is that you operate the business through a company. Um, and that goes back to, again, what we were talking about with the leases, where if you are operating through a company, the only way you're really personally going to be liable for the debts, the trading debts of the business, will be if you've given a personal guarantee. Okay, so you can use the corporate structure, but just be aware that if you are signing personal guarantees with various parties, that will surpass the corporate structure.
Yes, yes, I'm with you. And so let's run a case study, right? So two best friends, what they want to start a business. Let's call it a plumbing business of sorts,
Yep.
right? And one's a good plumber, the other one's a good admin person, so they've got a good synergistic relationship. Like, how would they best structure their finances if they know? Let's say they're guaranteed to get to $2 million top line revenue in 2 years' time. So it's going to be a fast growing company. It's going to be quite a profitable company as well for them. How would you go about sort of structuring their finances to ensure that they get protection and future planning as well, for
Yeah.
just in case a third business owner want to buy in or whatever it may be? Like, how would you go about doing that?
Yeah, and so this goes to your question before about shareholders agreements. A company is also very flexible as a business structure, because you can have additional shareholders brought on and leave the business as required, and that those changes in shareholding over time are also going to be exempt from duties, from state taxes. Like, to give you a counter example, if you were trading through a partnership, so you had a business partnership between you and your friend, the issue there is, if you were to make adjustments to that partnership, it would potentially be dutiable in some states and territories, which would come with additional costs whenever you try to leave or add another partner to the partnership. So, generally speaking, we tend to recommend in most cases that a corporate structure is used with appropriate shareholding, depending on the contributions of the parties to the business. Now, in addition, you're going to want to have in place a shareholders agreement that deals with the rights and obligations of the shareholders to one another. So, to give you a really clear example of why that's necessary, let's say you're a 50-50 shareholder with your friend. Well, in principle, there's nothing to stop your business partner from selling their shares to a third party, right, without your consent necessarily. So they could find somebody else who's interested in going halves on your business, and you might have no awareness of their credentials or their background. And to stop that from happening, you have a shareholders agreement in place, which makes it very clear that you would have a first right of refusal to purchase your business partner out if they wanted to leave.
Yeah, there you go. So there's quite a lot of these kind of tactics and well strategies to put in place to ensure that you protect the business first and foremost. Because obviously, when you're building up a business as part of your wealth creation strategy, you're part of your portfolio. You ultimately want to get that peace of mind that you can't get the rug pulled from underneath you, and
Yeah,
that's why it's important to sort of try and reverse engineer the ideal outcome. Now, if the ideal outcome is to have a succession plan within the business, let's hypothetically say, and you're looking to sell off, let's say, 50% of the business over the next 20 years, right, as a business owner, how would you go about putting that into the contract and then saying, well, we got first right of refusal and you can only sell it to someone in the company as well. I'm assuming everything's negotiable, right? You just chuck it all in the shareholders agreement.
yeah, that's right. In fact, a shareholders agreement is very flexible in terms of what can go in there. It like adds an extra layer of um, contractual rights to the relationship, and they can be very adaptable to whatever the parties desire. You mentioned like succession planning, so there's multiple ways you could do succession planning in a company. If you're a 100% owner of a company, if you've got a key employee, for example, that you want to take over the business over time, you could offer them an option plan. So over time, they could acquire shares in the company up to a set amount, and maybe with a final option to acquire the remaining part of the company. Um, there's many different ways you can go about that. There's many different ways you can approach it.
Yeah, right. And you guys help people out with that in terms of
Exactly.
how
Yeah.
to structure it best, basically.
Yeah. Definitely. And obviously, our employment law expertise helps us with planning for those particular employee share schemes.
Yeah. Okay. Good one. And would you say those are fairly common nowadays as businesses grow?
I think they're fairly common, or they're becoming more common, but they really need to be evaluated business by business. They're not for everyone. When you're granting these option rights to employees, you need to understand that it's a very real legal commitment, and you need to be very certain about the strategy before you go forward.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So there's obviously a risk reward, and you just got to get your head around all of that. Now, in
Definitely.
terms of protecting your brand, I don't know much about trademarks and how does that all work. I mean, I've heard horror stories of names of companies being taken away from them purely because they were infringing upon someone else's trademark
Yeah.
or yeah. So how do you risk mitigate against that kind of
Well,
risk?
look, if you're starting a new business, or for that matter, if you've got a business right now and you haven't done this exercise before, the first thing you need to do is you need to check and see, whether there's any other businesses out there in your jurisdiction which are trading under the same or similar name. That's really the first step, and then you kind of assess the legal position from there. Now, there's different types of intellectual property protection for business names or brands. The first and most basic level is the business name itself. So, in order to trade as a business in Australia, you have to have a registered business name, or you need to be trading under your legal name. So, to give you an example of that, you might be operating through a company, ABC Bob's Company Pty Ltd. That might be your company, but it might be trading under the name, Murphy's Fish and Chips or something like that, right? So you could have a separate business name to your legal name, but all those names go into one database, okay? And you can't use a name which is identical to another name on that list already,
I see.
okay? But I need to be clear. That's really the most basic level of intellectual property when it comes to business names. I probably wouldn't even really call it intellectual property, because if you actually want to stop other people from using your name, if you actually want to aggressively protect your brand and prosecute infringers, you need to have a trademark, right, for that brand, and that is very different to a business name. It goes on a different database entirely, the Australian Trademarks Database. And there's trademark databases in other jurisdictions around the world, and you can even apply for international trademarks if you need to, if you're going to be operating in multiple jurisdictions. And the difference there is that you're not protecting just the exact expression of your business name. You're actually protecting any names which are similar or closely resemble your trademark, or would be confusing in the mind of the consumer. Okay. Similarly, you can also protect not just names. You can protect the logo. You can protect slogans. In some cases, you can even protect things like scents. There's all sorts of ways you can use trademark to protect your brand and protect your reputation.
And from your experience, what kind of level of revenue do businesses who typically go down this route to protect their brands and their logos and their
They
taglines?
can be very small businesses,
Right.
and the fact is, depending on um, some trademark applications can be more uh, expensive than others, can be more involved than others, depending on, if you're just registering a trademark in Australia, are there other businesses out there which already have similar names that operate in your field? If that's the case, it's probably going to be a very expensive task to undertake. But if you've done your review, or you've got a lawyer or a professional that's skilled to do so, to do that review of the trademarks database and assess, well, look, we actually think you've got very good prospects. It can be a very, very straightforward procedure to get a trademark. It can cost you a couple of $1,000s in registration fees sometimes, or even less. It can cost as little as $500 in some cases for an application fee. Um, uh, you know, you should get it done, because you just don't know when somebody in the future might start trading under your name, and start um, siphoning off much of your goodwill.
Yeah, because theoretically, if you haven't got your trademark sorted, someone can come in and trademark your name. Is that what you're saying?
It's true. That's correct. Although you do have some protections if you were already using the name before they trademarked it. I won't get into the weeds too much there, but you've got some protections. But the problem is that, like, you can't really expand your business. You definitely don't own the trademark. It's just that they can't necessarily prosecute you, right? There are complexities to that, and everyone should obviously get legal advice if they're in that situation.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's it. Okay, cool, good stuff. So out of curiosity, then, what side of law do you enjoy the most, like practicing?
Um, Well, I mean, what I really enjoy is, I enjoy seeing how our clients develop their businesses over time. So, we've got many clients today which we were first introduced to going back 4 or 5 years ago, maybe even longer in some cases. Um, and they came to us for a particular reason. And as our relationship develops, we learn more about their business. We find more ways that we can assist them. We really try to be that long-term advisor for our clients. And I think I find that the most rewarding, is to see how far our own clients have come with our assistance, and with the assistance of their other professionals.
Cool. Okay, nice. And how big's the team now? Must be growing pretty rapidly.
Well, yeah, I mean, the commercial team, we've got a few lawyers here. The employment law team's about twice the size again, and the entire group, we've got about close to 100 employees over the entire national group.
Yeah, wow, that's a fairly sizable business, isn't it?
Yeah.
Fantastic, good stuff. Now, question for you: like, if you had, if like within the context of, let's call it wealth creation, right?
Yeah.
Like, if you can go back in time and tell your 18 or your 21-year-old self something, or spend an hour with them, what would be the changes that you would be getting your 21-year-old self to do?
Yeah. Look, I would be asked. I would be telling my 21-year-old self to become financially literate much earlier. To That's the first thing I do 100%. Like, I was a late comer to considering my own financial wealth and future and goals. So I'd go back and say, look, think about these things early. Read a couple of books, get some advice at that stage. Because I think it would have made a huge difference if I'd done that at 21 rather than doing that at 30. So definitely number one thing I do.
Yeah. No, you wouldn't want to drop the Bitcoin or a cryptocurrency kind of advice, or maybe Tesla.
Well, no, I wouldn't. I wouldn't.
You get them to get the foundations.
Get the
That's a good one. I like
foundations.
that. I like that.
Yeah, and
Good
think long term. Don't think short term.
100%, 100%. And for the small business owners or aspiring small business owners out there, what would be the top three things do you think that they really need to kind of take away from this particular podcast, and three action items that they need to do so that they can ensure that they protect themselves as
Okay,
best?
all right. Well, I think if I was to boil it down to maybe 3 points from what we've discussed, I'd say that make sure you've got the right business structure. who's involved in the business? Is it just you? Do you have a partner? Should it be a company? So make sure your structure's right. The second thing is be very circumspect about when you give a personal guarantee. All right, like that's a big one. If you're trading through a company, which most businesses do, be very, very careful. If somebody asks you for a personal guarantee, or there's a director's guarantee requirement in a credit application, think carefully about whether or not you really want to take on that liability. And if you do, keep a record of every guarantee you've ever given. That might be really, really important. If your business is in dire straits one day, you need to know which creditors could come after you personally and where your exposure is. And really the third point there as well is I would just say, look, if you have a contract, read the contract. And I know it's really hard for a business owner, but scan through it, and the terms, which are obviously strange and onerous, they do jump out at you when you read through these things. So I'd recommend read it as best you can and get legal advice if you don't understand it.
Absolutely. And speaking of getting legal advice, where do we best find you, mate, and your team?
Okay, well, you can find us at www.lawyersforemployers.com.au, and you can reach me as well on LinkedIn, Daniel Dash at NB Lawyers.
Fantastic. Good stuff. Well, thanks very much for your time today. Much appreciated. Obviously, you're a very, very busy man, and it's a busy season as well. So hopefully there'll be a bunch of questions. If you've got any questions, make sure you fire them at us in the comments. I meet Daniel once every fortnight, once every month or so. So I'll make sure to pester him with some of the big questions that you guys ask. We really appreciate your time, mate, and looking forward to catching up next time.
Excellent. Thanks, Andrew.
Chat soon. See you guys.